I had a woman in group years ago whose husband was struggling maintaining sobriety. And she said, I got, tired of the rug getting pulled out from underneath me, so I decided to stand on my own rug. Yeah. And I love that analogy.
Yeah, that's great.
And she said, for a season, I needed to move my rug away, and they took a redemptive separation. As he continued to do his work, she said it was then safer for me to move my rug, so to speak, back closer to him. Yeah. But part of what I think was true for her is she had to learn what that looked like, to stand on her own rug.
Welcome to the Faithful and True podcast. We are back with you today with the powerhouse team that we had on our last podcast with, of course, our usual host, Dr. Greg Miller, his wife, Beth, Rebecca Dekkers from our staff here at Faithful and True. Happy to have you with us, Rebecca. And with the clinical director of Faithful and True, Jim Farm. So I'd like...
He always does that.
Jim likes always a little special note. So we're happy to have you with us today, and we are back today. And Greg, what are we going to talk about?
Well, we're going to continue the conversation from the last podcast. And for those of you that were here, we talked about some of the indications that a husband may not be fully invested or committed to his recovery. And so in part two, what we're going to be talking about are some of the options, some of the ways that a wife might respond and how she can navigate when her perception is her husband's not fully invested into recovery. And so let's just start with what causes this topic to be important, because it's one that we've talked about, kind of the importance of this. So why do you suppose that this topic is something that we need to do a podcast about?
Well, I think this is a subject that when it comes up, there's a lot of fear on the part of the wife because she understands what's at stake. She understands that for her to be able to stay in the relationship, to respect herself and stay, that there needs to be a real knowing in her that her husband is committed to his recovery. So when that doesn't feel like that's what's happening, when her intuition is telling her from some of the signs, things we talked about in the last podcast, it can get really chaotic of, her options of what it is she needs to do.
Yeah, I would say, I'm assuming, it's fairly typical that a woman is afraid that she has made a mistake in staying. Mm-hmm. And that my guess is she had voices telling her that she should just leave, she has every right to leave, it's probably the easiest, wisest thing to leave. So it makes perfect sense if she's starting to get information that she's starting to question was staying the best option. That is incredibly disruptive for her.
Yeah, there's often a lot of self-doubt, right? Like, did I make the right choice? And truly, it just like your answer, it just matters so much that he is committed to healing, because it leads to a lot of choices for her. And there's a rigidity, I need this you to be fully committed to what is your work. And it really confronts her with a lot of her own powerlessness, with it, which in light of where she is, that is scary. I mean, that's part of all of our work, is to reckon with our own powerlessness, what's mine, what's not mine. But when there is that sense, that indication, perhaps he's not as invested, not throwing as much energy or intentionality to this, that highlights that so much for her.
Mm-hmm. I would also say, I'm guessing again, that for a lot of women, one of their fears is that her husband will start with a bang and be very committed to recovery, and then in time it will fade. Maybe she's seen this before. I mean, a large number of the men that come through our workshop, they have been wrestling with this issue for years, and so this isn't the first time that they've been in this pattern or this cycle. And so for the wife who chooses to stay, in some way, this is that fear realized that he's not going to stay committed. And so it makes sense that that would intensify her chaos and her concern when she sees it not for the first time, but again.
Mhm. Yeah, Jim, in our last podcast, you mentioned this idea that sometimes it begins to show that a guy's motivation really isn't his.
That's right.
That he's borrowing somebody else, or he feels the pressure of his wife saying, if you don't, then.
That's right.
Which does not lead to a person's long-term recovery.
No, it really doesn't. Because it's not internal. They don't have that internal motivation. I would add, for some guys too, that it's a painful experience because I think from a spouse's perspective, it's like, you're not choosing me. You're you're continuing to choose the addiction. And one of the things I always kind of think about, as long as I've been doing this, the guys that have struggled the most, oftentimes have had the most pain.
Yeah.
And so it's both and. It's very painful for a spouse, but oftentimes when there's a lot of resistance, there's a lot of pain that guy doesn't want to go to. You know what I mean? I'll never forget, I always tell this story because I think it's funny, because my last name's Farm, as everybody knows, but I had this farmer that came in, and I swear he saw me almost every week for 12 months. And he was just in denial. And I'd push him, and he'd get so upset with me, and he'd leave, and he'd say, I'm done with you, farm boy. He'd call me farm boy. He loved my last name because he's a farmer. He just loved it, so he just called me farm boy. But about 12 months in, we finally kind of broke through, and he started to share some of his pain. And then as he left, he goes, "You finally got me, farmer." Changed it from farm boy to farmer. And that kind of story sticks with me.
Yeah.
That sometimes, it's not so much they, don't want to, be done with the addiction or get through the addiction. There's a lot of pain that they have to go through. And so sometimes it's a both end. The spouse is experiencing that, very painful way.
Yeah.
And for the guy, it's like, I got to work through all this stuff.
Yeah.
And I wonder, for some wives, they actually have the intuition that there is pain that their husband is avoiding, and they have the knowing that until he's willing to go after that, there's not going to be a lot of progress that is made.
Yeah, I think a couple of things happen when that surfaces. One of the things that we see is, understandably, a wife can sort of panic. And because she knows what's at stake, right? And one of the things we talk about here at Faithful and True is our hoops. Other language might refer to it as like our lane. And we see sometimes a wife get in the husband's hoop, or kind of move into his lane and begin to direct his recovery, right? Like, she's taking the vigilance that should be his, but when that vigilance isn't showing up, she's moving into his lane to kind of control and say, you need to do this, you need to, just the other day I heard someone say, I told my husband he needs to call Jim Farm, right? Like, well, that might be better if he is the one doing that rather than you telling him, but that it makes sense that she's over there. And what we often talk about is you got to get back into your hoop to figure out what your choices are from your vantage point.
I think one of the things that is complicated is, for some relationships, being in each other's hoop or being in each other's lane is the only way they've experienced intimacy. So it's not just it doesn't work for recovery. In some ways, you're asking a spouse to no longer create intimacy in the way they have from the very beginning, because that's the nature of enmeshment. And so I think that probably would be part of the challenge you're addressing. That's not good for his recovery, or that's not going to be helpful for his recovery. But in the long term, that's not a relationship strategy either that's going to lead to intimacy.
Yeah, that's why often I like to help wives see that pragmatically. It's just is not going to work to meet the deeper need. Like, if I have a need for my husband to take charge of his recovery, the mere fact of my being in his hoop trying to do that is literally cutting my need off at the knees. Like, it's literally not helping. And so even though it makes so much sense that I'm getting pulled into managing your stuff, it's to see that while this feels like a step back, and I'm having to come back to what do I feel, what do I need, what's going on for me, that is actually going to get me closer to meeting what that need might be.
Yeah.
Well, it gets both of you stuck, because
Yeah.
if you're in his hoop, then he never is able to learn his own skills and strategies
Yeah.
That's right.
to work through it, and then both of you are kind of hopeless.
Yeah.
I had a woman in group years ago whose husband was struggling maintaining sobriety, and she said, I got, tired of the rug getting pulled out from underneath me, so I decided to stand on my own rug.
Yeah.
And I love that analogy.
Yeah, that's great.
And she said, for a season, I needed to move my rug away, and they took a redemptive separation. As he continued to do his work, she said it was then safer for me to move my rug, so to speak, back closer to him.
Yeah.
But part of what I think was true for her is she had to learn what that looked like to stand on her own rug. And that's part of what we talk about at the women's workshop and in our groups and appointments, is learning I need to be a whole person in my own self, capable of being alone should that be necessary. Because that's going to be one of the things that drives me into my husband's hoop, if I fear that I don't know how to be, on my own.
One of the things, or a couple of things about recovery that I think creates chaos in the coupleship is simultaneously recovery is easy and incredibly difficult. In some way, recovery is very simple and very complex. And so what can happen is the wife is able to see the simplicity of it. Just do it. Go to your meetings. Be honest, tell your therapist what's going on. And then the husband is in the complexity of history and old family rules and patterns. It's very simple, but it's very complex, It's very easy. Just do this thing, but it's also very hard because it's about being. And I think that that's where, when a wife's intuition is that he's not doing it, living in the fullness of the truth actually is helpful for her, I would think, of living in that tension, not letting her husband's actions define her, but not making something complex simple or simple complex, but living in the both end of that.
Yeah. Well, I just think of, when I do couples work, and if a guy is struggling with his sobriety, basically, I automatically think he's emotionally unavailable. And if the spouse is, expecting emotional availability when it's just not there, it really kind of leaves her in a bad spot. So it really kind of is like what you guys are talking about, is where is the healthy places then when my spouse is not emotionally available? And quite frankly, even if it was a perfect marriage, there's going to be times in a perfect marriage in which your spouse isn't emotionally available. So it provides a great opportunity for her, if he does get into recovery, that she has that skill when he's not going to be there, because we're finite human beings, right?
Well, what if what's true is, for all of us, it's important that we live in what is happening, not what is possible. And so when a wife is seeing that her husband's not committed to recovery, he's not invested, he's not being transformed, that may be a painful reality, and yet that's the reality that she is living in and needs to find her way forward in. And yes, we can talk about what might be possible if he does this and does this and does this, but at this point he's not doing that. What might be some ways that you can encourage a woman to live in the reality of where her husband is and what he is or isn't doing?
Well, one of the things I like to talk with my clients about is how we get to this place where we just are taking care of what's right at the end of our nose. We're not shooting down the road what is not happening. And that idea of taking it as information, being really aware about what is or is not happening, because partly as in working with wives, it's their work to take in information about what is going well in recovery or perhaps what isn't. And so right-sizing that, increasing in some ways their distress tolerance skills, being able to manage and breathe through where they are, learning to resource and find safety with perhaps other people. But a big skill I often find is the ability to self-validate. What I'm needing and asking for is valid. That often wives want their husbands to see it, so they're busy trying to tell him, like, do these things, don't you see? But kind of, again, coming back to her hoop and saying, this is a valid need, and I can hold it, and I can be aware of it, yeah.
Oh, I love that.
Mm.
I think one of the things we hear a lot is when a husband isn't doing the things that would represent someone who is in recovery, the urge is for the wife to say to her husband, you need to change your behavior. Here are the things you need to do. And of course, there are some things that he would need to do differently. One of the things that I think is helpful instead is for her to sit with, what do I need to do differently, right? Do I need to close my gate for a season? Whatever that may mean, and that can mean a lot of different things. Do I need to stop acting like business as usual, right? And just pretending and hoping that things are going to change. And that's a really significant shift. Because if I'm telling him, here's what you need to do differently, here are the changes you need to make, that creates a parent-child dynamic, like this mother-son dynamic that, is so chaotic and doesn't serve anybody. Rather, if we are partners and I am in my hoop saying, this is what I need to feel safe, and I'll need to figure out how to take good care of myself if that isn't possible. And it's not said in threatening language or, throwing gauntlets down, that kind of thing, but just knowing for me to be able to respect myself and stay, this is, what I'll need. And, it's interesting. One of the things that I hear sometimes, a woman was telling me recently that she was sitting in the, with her husband and his therapist. She had been invited into that conversation, and the therapist said, would you tell him what you need for him to do differently? And she said, I was able to stop and say, actually, I've communicated, I want him to be in recovery. I feel like that's his work with you in community, in group, right? Rather than me coming up with this checklist of things. This is work that when someone's really in recovery, they don't need to be told. Here's a checklist, right?
We talk at the men's workshop about early in recovery, typically what we're motivated by is desperation. And our circumstances, people's reactions, consequences create that desperation. But no matter how much desperation we have, at some time the desperation fades, and at some point we have to find desire. And I think what is just true is I cannot find desire for somebody else. That's very much what you're saying. Is no matter what somebody else does, in this case we're talking about a wife, no matter what she does, she cannot ignite a desire in her husband. And so my guess is part of that intuition is that awareness that he doesn't desire this enough. And it's probably appropriate that the first spiritual question is basically, do you want to get well? Which is a question of desire, because what we desire, we pursue. And so I think, the women that you're working with are having that awareness that part of my work is not to focus on his desire, but to focus on my desire given my circumstances and his choices. And that is a much more challenging journey, and some of that will involve grief, because some of my desires will not be realized because he's not committed or desiring it himself.
And one of the things I like to talk with clients about is that I retain ownership of my need. I might have a need, but in the for a greater sense of assurance that you're involved, but in the end, that's my need. Often we go around trying to place them on people, but that's mine. And so again, like that gal said, she knew she needed greater safety, so she moved her rug away for a time.
Yeah. I also think that, like what you were just talking about, a wife may sense that in the present moment, the husband doesn't have the desire and or the willingness to engage his recovery. And what may be true is that you could add the word yet to that. And that doesn't mean that she has to just wait around and subject herself to painful things. She may need to move her rug, right? And I also really want to validate that these decisions of how long to stay when you sense your husband may not be fully committed to recovery, that decision is really challenging, especially when children are involved. And so I can't validate enough the need to be wise and discerning, to slow down, to, like you said, create safety for yourself, to engage your own tools, your own wisdom, doing your own work around that. And what we tend to see is that eventually a decision gets clear. A person will walk their way into an answer of that question. And because if a person really is committed to recovery, that makes itself known. You know, it isn't this real challenging thing. We hear over and over women say, I've just experienced him differently. Like, I am experiencing him differently.
Yes.
And so we know that shift. And we also know what it feels like in us, right? When we're getting well and doing our own work, we understand what that shift feels like.
Okay, so I'm going to make an assumption. And the assumption is that women don't always show up in their wise woman when they're trying to have these conversations with their husband. And so what coaching would you give? Because what's true is we're not always going to be our best selves. That's true for the person struggling with the addiction and recovery. He may be working an amazing program, and at times he is not his best self. So we're going to assume that's true for women. So how do you encourage, how do you support, how do you validate a woman who might have not been showing up well and maybe feels shame about that or feels discouraged by that? What does it look like to support her?
Well, I always like to say at first it makes sense, right? It's scary, it matters so much. So perhaps any not showing up out of really who you want to be, some of that just makes sense. And now as we're learning new skills and we're learning to name and identify where we are and where we'd like to go and these new places and things we'd like to learn, surely Beth said it, like learning to slow down, learning to be known in community, learning to take some of the energy off of what I need, learning to re-regulate, and then, the work of icebergs. I always love to direct clients to icebergs and really getting clear about what do I need and what are my choices. Often there's so much energy when I have, like I said at the beginning, we are confronted with our powerlessness. And we have choices. And so being able to reconnect with what's true and what choices I have, then I tend to be able to show up better.
The only thing I would add to that is learning to take ownership for those times when I don't show up well.
Yeah.
And, I can own that I know that can be challenging for a woman who, maybe was really unhealthy in her anger. And that can be challenging to want to show up and apologize for that. We're not excusing, we're not trying to, and I hear this of a husband saying, well, you yelled at me, trying to
Right.
create this balance scale of who's done what. And that takes us nowhere fast. But I do think that we're not in any way asking her to take ownership for his acting out, but just any contribution that she's making to the dynamic in the coupleship where it might be challenging, especially if she is not showing up in her wise adult. And that's out of her own pain. Again, we're not making excuses for it. It is really understandable. And we can all rise to be people of integrity as we're doing this very hard work.
Yeah. You know, sometimes truth is spoken and it's done in such a way that it's just clear. And it's not necessarily seen as a threat, it's just truth. I know in our story, there was a time when we were talking about something and you basically said, Greg, if you don't go after this, we really don't have a future. And fortunately, I was in enough of my, I didn't have this language back